Hi, I'm Sarah Mirk. I'm an editor at the Nib, and I'm here today with Derf. Hi, Derf.
Hi, Sarah.
Derf is the author of a new book called Kent State. It's a graphic history of the shooting at the school. And for people that don't know about Kent State, can you tell us a little bit about what happened and specifically what you remember happening when you were a kid?
Oh,
Because you
well,
grew up,
yeah,
this happened when you were 10 years old. So
right.
what do you remember hearing about the shooting at the time as a 10-year-old?
Well, it was 1970 was a really bad year, like one of the worst we've ever had, though 2020 is well on its way to topping it. But it's very similar. It was just all of these big forces that had been, tearing the nation apart, all of a sudden were just crashing together. And so everybody was freaking out. Everybody was angry, paranoid, concerned, anxious the whole bit. And it all came to a head at Kent State, which now in 1970, the big issue was the anti-war movement, which millions on the streets protesting against the Vietnam War and specifically against the draft, because remember, the Vietnam War was fought by draftees. I mean, that wasn't volunteers. You had no choice but to go. And um, And like I said, it all came to a head in spring 1970 for a variety of reasons, but there were massive protests and a lot of campuses had a lot of unrest. Kent State had some. It wasn't the worst. It wasn't even the worst in Ohio, but it did have some, and troops were sent in. The National Guard was sent in to put it down, and they wound up opening fire on basically on a parking lot full of students, killing four, shooting nine. And it was this pivotal moment in certainly in 20th century history when, the government turned turned guns on its own people and for daring to dissent. Does any of this sound vaguely familiar? I mean, it's like we've circled back around completely to 1970 and apparently learned nothing. The similarities are positively chilling. And So that's basically what happened. And, it was like, as I said, it was a pivotal moment and really kind of, I think, the end of that period, which we call the 60s, that period of protest and this cataclysmic, you know, societal changes and all of this stuff that was washing over the nation in waves. Kent State was kind of the final moment of it, the final bloody moment of it. Maybe it was inevitable, but it was the moment the authorities cracked down on all the stuff that had been threatening their power. Yeah, again, this all sounds vaguely familiar. So that's the story.
And so you were growing up really close by, actually. You lived in Ohio in a small town, and you were 10 years old when this
Right.
shooting happened. So how did you experience this as a kid? Is it something you remember hearing about on the radio or parents talking about, like in
Right.
hushed tones?
Yeah, yeah, they were. I mean, they tried. I mean, you try to keep things away from kids, but kids hear things anyways. The National Guard that went to Kent State was actually in my little hometown the week before. There was a trucker strike, and they were deployed there to crush the trucker strike. Again, this was a Republican governor at the time, an authoritarian strongman, who was also running for a primary election, which was taking place in early May. And he was pandering to his base to try to win this election. So first he went after the Teamsters, then he went after unruly student radicals, which were the two big boogeymen of 1970 for the Republicans. Now it would be, BLM protesters or Antifa or whoever. Excuse me. And so I saw all this thing happening place, and it was very disturbing to me as a kid because it was as if this whole outside world had suddenly just come rushing into this little town I was living in, which had been pretty peaceful and bucolic up till then. Very happy kid life. I didn't think about much of anything, and suddenly here's the world, with guns and troops invading my hometown. And I was also a paper boy. It was my first job in newspapers. And so I delivered those papers, where it showed that iconic photo of Jeffrey Miller dead on the ground that everybody knows. And so that's really how I absorbed that particular news event. It was there in the paper when I picked them up to deliver them. And so you process it in the way that kids process things. I mean, it was an emotional event for me, but I don't know that I understood it. But because of that, I've always carried this story with me, for the rest of my life. I mean, when you grow up in this area and you're of a, particular age, maybe a 20-year period there, it's part of your DNA. I mean, everybody knows about Kent State because you knew somebody who was there, or you went to Kent State, or whatever, and it's just part of us. And so I've always been interested in this story, and I've always wanted to take on the project. It was just a matter of when.
So what got you started on working on this graphic novel? Was it something that you had been pitching for a long time, or did it seem particularly relevant like after the 2016
Well, it
election?
did, yeah. After 2016, yeah, it seemed very relevant. I mean, I didn't think it would be this relevant. Um, the book was supposed to come out in the spring, uh, which would have coincided with the 50th anniversary of the shootings. So that was a nice peg to have, because publishers need kind of like that peg to hang a book on it, and that was a natural one. And so yeah, that was really what prodded me to do it. And it was just, I finally felt confident enough in my own abilities to tackle this book, because it's a very, very challenging book to both write and draw for a variety of reasons. And I just didn't feel that I had the skills that I needed before now. I needed to do a couple books first, And I finally decided about 4 years ago when I started it, it's now or never. Let's just do it.
What were some of the biggest challenges in creating this book?
Well, it's a big event. I mean, there's a lot of, it's kind of a sweeping event that involves, there's a lot of backstory. There's a lot of secret machinations going on beneath the surface. There's a lot of lies because there was a cover up and the cover up stuck. Um, so there's still some ambiguities. There's still some things that aren't known. And just the drawing challenges. I mean, I'd never really tackled something like this before. You've got these big sweeping crowd scenes and military scenes, lots of night scenes, night military crowd scenes. I mean, it's stuff I've never drawn before, and it really it kind of kicked my ass at times. But you just keep soldiering on, and it seemed to work out in the end. You can't have any fear in comics. It's just like you just got to throw yourself into it and hope for the best.
Yeah, I like that. I think every comics project seems impossible and is full of so many challenges that you can't really think ahead to all the things you can't do
No,
before
you
you get
can't worry
started.
about it. You can't worry about it. But my other books have not been this challenging in the drawing. No, not even close.
Hmm.
And that was the other books were kind of more familiar territory and easier for me to draw. But this was new stuff.
I was curious about your approach to the book in that it's not straight nonfiction. So this isn't like
Right.
a 100% based on um, archival research book, but you did do a ton of research, and a lot of it is like very visually accurate,
Right.
but then and based on scenes that you read about, but then you describe the book as a reenactment. So a lot of the dialogue is imagined.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, I wasn't
it's
there. I mean,
yeah.
I'm relying on, but it's all sourced. I mean,
Hmm.
the way I compose dialogue, and I did this a little with my friend Dahmer, which was my other, uh, nonfiction book. Um, I base it on dialogue on sourced facts, like source material, like if Jeff Miller was one of the kids, one of the main characters, he's talking about switching majors, for example, just in a conversation, casual conversation, or what he wants to do with his life. Well, all that comes from a source, and it's footnoted where that source came from. So that's how I kind of construct that stuff. But at the beginning, right on the first page, I say it's dramatic recreation. I mean, and that's what it is. So if you're upfront about it, I don't think there's a problem.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading the book with the sources are in the back. So I was like reading the book and then had one hand in the source pages and was looking back to see like,
My
what is
wife will
this
be
based on?
thrilled. My wife will be thrilled to hear that.
Did she
She's
write the source pages?
no, but she edited them because
Oh, okay.
she was a journalist for many years, and she's like a footnote fiend.
I am
So
also a footnote
are you?
fiend. Yeah,
She'll be overjoyed.
I think you can judge the quality of a book based on its source pages, and
Oh,
sometimes they're like very tidy, and you're like, wow, they know their stuff, and
oh.
sometimes you're like, this is a mess, even
Yeah,
before you've even started reading.
she really held my feet to the flame for about a week editing those footnotes. So,
But I
um,
was curious about how you approach that balance between trying to create something that feels really true to the events, but then also making these creative decisions to tell a story.
right. Well, that's the tricky part, right? I mean, it's a very dramatic story. I mean, it's full of emotion and suspense, and even though we know what's going to happen in the end, I mean, we know these kids are going to die. The ending really it packs a wallop, um, and that's just you have to rely on your instincts as a storyteller, and I don't know, that seems to come pretty naturally to me, maybe more natural than other comics things I've tried in the past. So it just came together. I mean, I knew the story I wanted to tell. I had it in my head. You have to decide when you start a book. What's my story about? And from the beginning, I decided to tell it purely through the eyes and the experiences of the four people who were killed. And then I added a fifth thread, which was a young guardsman, whose account I came across. So I have these five threads, and that really is how the story is told. So the reader is literally on the ground with these people, walking with them, and we see what they see and experience what they experience. And I thought that would make it very dramatic and emotional and personal. And when they're cut down, yeah, you feel it. And I wanted it to be felt because, you know, talking to the students of 1970, and I interviewed many of them, I wanted to give just a sense of how they feel this history. I mean, it's still a big wound, and I wanted to get that across. So those were my goals, and the way I chose to dramatize it the way I did.
Um, yeah, I liked the choices that you made, but it did feel like, oh geez, I would, it'd be tough to figure out sort of how to balance all of this. And then another thing that really struck me while reading it is just how much of the story was surprising to me or new or unexpected. Even as
Right,
somebody, myself, I grew up hearing about Kent State from my parents and, seeing the photos, but actually I didn't know the story. And so I'm
right.
curious about what, in your opinion, do most Americans misunderstand about Kent State? What's the narrative that we hear versus the narrative that actually happened?
Well, the narrative I think most people hear is that there was a protest, and the guard was sent in, and something happened, and there was a horrible accident, and a bunch of students got shot. And that is not the story. I mean, there were a lot of politics involved. There were a lot of secret machinations by the FBI, the CIA, military intelligence. Nixon was involved, the state government, the local government, law enforcement. There were all sorts of undercover ops all over the campus, as there were in most big campuses at that time. And um, there was also a good measure of malevolence because this group of guardsmen, no more than 16, decided at some point, for reasons known only to them, because none of them have talked, um, we've had enough. Wait for the signal, and then we're going to open fire on these bastards. And so it's a much, much more complicated story than I think most people realize. And that's that's why we write history, is to explain these things, you know, and to show things as they happened.
One thing I really liked about the book was that you did include this fifth story of a National Guardsman, and that was based on an interview that a National Guardsman did. I believe it was anonymously, and you
Hmm.
give him a name in the book. But
Right.
um, and I like that you included that story so that we can sort of see what the Guardsmen are going through, and that basically they're like a bunch of really young guys who are super sleep deprived and have been deployed for days and are following the orders of pretty incompetent leadership while holding
Hmm.
dangerous, deadly weapons.
Right.
So I was curious about how you tried to both tell their story without justifying what they did, you know, like humanizing who they were without saying like, and therefore it makes a lot of sense that they opened fire.
Right. Well, I don't know about that. No, it doesn't make sense they opened fire. There's a lot of different stories there because you're talking about 1,200 guardsmen. So it ran the gamut. Yeah, some of them were really young, but a lot of them were in their 30s. So, you know, a very common narrative is that, well, they were the same age as the students, they were just like the students, and you know, there was that kind of youthful, you know, inexperience and naivete, which is really not true. I mean, most of these guys were older. So, I mean, their decisions, something else was driving their decisions. They certainly were under the command of incompetent leadership. I mean, the officers had their heads so far up their ass it could barely see daylight. And the top commanders were basically politicians, and they were working for the governor, and they were doing his bidding. So that was a different motivation entirely. Um, the account of the guardsmen that I use, it was a really great account, and you know, it's very blunt. Um, I liked it because it was so detailed, and it has, like, you know, the day-to-day stuff that they went through, like how they slept, and you know, how they ate, and what the commanders were doing, and they were being ordered here and around, you know, and all that stuff. And that was really great, and I thought it was important to include that. Um, that guardsman in particular, I think he believes he comes across better than he does. Um, he's a bit of a braggart, and he's a super hard ass. He went on to be work in law enforcement, and he talks like a cop, you know. And he's really unrepentant about a lot of stuff that happened, including, like, you know, bayoneting a co-ed in the back. I mean, and so I just used his words directly. It's like, okay, here, you said it, here it is, and depicted visually. And I think it, when you see it visually, it really, it has a much bigger impact than just, you know, his description. So yeah, those are the decisions I made. But I thought it was an important viewpoint to have, not to be like, you know, the bullshit CNN panel type thing, you know, where you have a guy on the left and a guy on the right, and they just yell at each other. I mean, I that's not what I wanted, but I wanted the experience of the guardsmen, but certainly not to excuse what they did. No, not at all, because what they did was murder. I mean, it was essentially, they committed murder and they got away with it.
Yeah, I think that that kind of storytelling is different than the media trap of two sidesism of like, well, there's
Right,
two sides to every story. There's the protesters and then there's National Guardsmen, which is
right.
different when one side has guns and the authority of the state on their
Well,
side.
exactly. Yeah, and tanks and
Yeah.
helicopters. Yeah, no, it was a travesty.
And so much about the both the incidents and the political atmosphere in this book really felt very much like it was depicting today or could have been today.
That's right.
I live in Portland,
Right.
and all summer long here there have been protests against police brutality. Federal uh, guards have responded like they did at Kent State. There's been escalating violence. There's been tear gas, and then there's been absolutely no accountability of any kind for
Right.
violence
Yeah, no,
perpetrated
we've
by the
learned
state.
nothing. And we've
Hmm.
learned nothing. We've circled completely back around. The one thing I will say is that I don't think um, the protesters in 1970, the student protesters, they had no idea they were in danger. They didn't think the guards' guns were loaded. Even when bullets were like pinging off the pavement, some of the students were saying, "Don't worry, they're only blanks." I don't think anybody taking part in the protest today has that misconception.
Hmm.
So that's the lasting legacy of Kent State right there. I mean, they know that they can be shot, and they know that they can pay a very bitter price for standing up and protesting against the authorities, and they do it anyways. And I find that actually to be very inspiring.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I really felt like reading through the book, there was a sense of like optimism and kind of like naivete about the power of the state that we don't.
Definitely
Yeah,
naivete, definitely. Yeah, that was, yeah. Because, up until that point, there really hadn't been, I mean, there'd been some crackdowns, there'd been a lot of gas and a lot of, it was kind of a game that the protesters were playing with the cops and even the guard, and it felt like a game in many ways on May 4. And then it wasn't, and it never would be again. But, I just think that was probably because people didn't realize the danger they were in up until that point.
yeah. And another clear parallel is how the protesters were portrayed as like kind of like a boogeyman
Mhm.
in the minds of the more conservative people, and especially the National Guardsmen in town, where I feel like you could replace the word hippies with the word Antifa, and it would
Yep.
basically be about today.
Right.
And there was so many rumors that spread like wildfire that that there was a student sniper, that the students
Right.
had been trained in Cuba as communists. Um, what do you feel like is totally different than today, and what are some other parallels that you saw between then and now, like what's different?
I don't think a lot is different actually. I mean, I mean, every time Trump flaps his gums, he's, coming up with some ridiculous statement about this imaginary Antifa horde that's planning the overthrow of the government. I think it was actually more real in 1970 because there actually were organizations. I mean, they actually existed as opposed to Antifa, like the Weathermen or the Revolutionary Youth Movement or the Black Panthers or some of the other radical groups that were actual groups and had members and leadership and the whole bit. Um, but other than that, the parallels are exactly the same. It's always people leveraging fear to hold on to power. I mean, that seems to be a very American thing. And we see it over and over and over and over again. And, here we are again.
People leveraging fear to hold on to power could be the subtitle of the book,
It should have
actually.
been, yeah.
Well, I wanted to look at a couple pages from the book and then compare them to some archival photos and
Okay.
research that you did. So let's check it out. Can you tell us about this page?
Yeah, this is the really pivotal moment just before the guard opens fire. And this is the power of comics as a recreation device, because what you're seeing here in the top panel is what the guards saw as they looked down this hill, which is called Blanket Hill. And they looked down at this parking lot full of students and the crowd, the remaining protesters at the bottom of the hill. And afterwards, the guard would claim that they were surrounded and that they were about to be overrun. Now, does that look like they were about to be overrun? And I wanted to really give a sense of the distance between where the guard was and where the students they shot were, which was about 250 to 300 feet away. It's the length of a football field. And I actually, I mean, the site is still there. It's now a National Historical Site. And, I spent a lot of time on Blanket Hill, just looking down this hill and composing some of these scenes. And I thought it was really key because this particular scene doesn't exist. This particular image, the guard, you see it right, you see what the guard saw. That doesn't exist. That is something that I created out of source material.
Yeah, let's look at some of those
Yep.
uh, things. All right.
Yeah, this is one of the uh, photos that came out years later when the parents of the slain students sued the National Guard. So what you're seeing here is the reverse angle. This is the parking lot looking up, and you can see the guard clustered at the top there, right on the ridge line. There's like that big umbrella like structure there. That's called the pagoda, and that's where they were. And then there's the students at the bottom of the hill, and this is right at the moment that the guard turned and opened fire. This is the exact moment. So you can see some of the students are hitting the ground. And so I had to reverse this angle and show the guard looking down the hill.
Yeah, what's so striking about this image to me is I think the story that I heard about Kent State as well was that there was a crowd of protesters and
Right.
guardsmen opened fire. And in my mind, it was like, oh, there's like a giant crowd of like rowdy protesters that and the National Guard felt overwhelmed. But then looking at
Yeah,
this photo, it's like, where are the people?
exactly. Where's the threat? Where's the threat? And what they said was afterwards, immediately afterwards, is that they were about to be overrun, that 1,000 students were rushing them up the hill. That you see 1,000 students there, and that the air was black with stones. Do you see the air black with stones? I mean, you know, from where the protesters, the remaining protesters are, and they're clustered there at the bottom of the hill, and there's some off camera to the right. I mean, you'd have to be the Kent State starting quarterback to heave a rock that far. I mean, there's no way. So, image, you know, showing images can actually really dispel these lies, and these lies stuck. I mean, they got away with it. This is
What's this
actually,
photo?
this is a still from the only video footage of the shootings. So this is taken from a dorm that's in the foreground, and he's well up. He's like on the 10th or 11th floor of the dorm, shooting down, and the guard is on the left there. You can't really see it very well, and the crowd is at the bottom of the hill. But the great thing about this video footage, and it's only like maybe a minute long, is you can see the movements. You can see exactly what the guard was facing, and then they turned and opened fire, and then all these students start running in the opposite direction. It's really an amazing piece of footage, but it didn't come out for years. And so I used this footage, and I used the photos, the court photos, to recreate that one scene that we looked at the beginning, that one panel.
I looked up some photos of the National Guard at Kent State too to compare them to
Okay.
your drawings. So
Yeah, they were kind of a motley crew. The National Guard at this time, you know, most of these guys got their guard spots to stay out of Vietnam because the guard didn't go abroad. The guard was stateside back then. And their equipment was all Army hand-me-downs from like World War II or Korea. So they all had different pieces of uniforms. They all had all the Jeeps and the trucks were of different vintage. I mean, it looked like a literally at which was its rep, the ragtag army. I mean, it looked like they got everything out of salvage. But these were deadly weapons.
and I like how in your comic, one thing you draw attention to is how they wore these big gas masks and could barely even see, could barely even hear.
Right. Yeah, here you go. Getting back to research. There's one of them.
Oh wow. Did
Yeah.
did you get that in an army surplus store or?
Yeah. I got this. Actually, I got it off eBay. It's a Vietnam era get, much like the kind I just wanted, because what some of the things they said about the gas masks, I wanted to see if it was true. So I got one, and I actually mowed the backyard a couple times wearing this thing, which only cemented my reputation to my neighborhood. But I wanted, you know, on a hot day, because I wanted to feel what it was like. And yeah, it was very uncomfortable. But there were a couple things that they said which just aren't true. Like they couldn't talk out of the gas mask, so they couldn't communicate with each other. You can talk through these things. You can hear, you know, I mean, I had my son stand like 20 feet away, and I talked to him, and he could understand every word I said. So there were a number of things that I wanted to check out on this, and so you know, you got to take that extra step.
Oh, okay. I've got some more photos to show.
Sure,
This is the most iconic photo from Kent State.
right,
This is the one that was in my high school history book. Can
right,
you tell us about this photo and then how you decided to use
sure.
it in the book?
This is a young protester named Marianne Vecchio, who was only 14. Whoops,
Sorry.
standing over the body of Jeff Miller in that horrible river of blood. It was taken by a student photographer named John Philo, who won the Pulitzer Prize for this photo. And it's, you know, easily one of the greatest news photos of certainly the last half of the 20th century. and maybe of all time. I mean, it's, just an iconic photo. But the challenge that I faced, it's a key moment in the book where the horror of what has happened is really registers with all these poor students. And so I wanted to depict it, but I didn't just want to imitate it. You know what I mean? Because that just to recreate it in my own style, that would seem like really staged and really, contrived and stiff. I wanted the scene to have some life. So I had to think of a different way to do it. Oh, and this is what I chose. And so instead of focusing really on the girl and Jeff, what I focus on is the sound effect of the scream, because that's the one thing that the photo doesn't have and comics can do, because we have those sound effects. And so the sound effect becomes the main graphic element of this spread. And you can see the scream carries over onto the other page. It actually starts on the previous page. So it's a 3-page scream that just kind of, rolls over this scene. And because that's what people were describing to me as I was talking to them, that all they heard was screams after, there was this heavy moment of silence after the guns stopped, and then all they heard were screams. So I really wanted to capture that.
And we've got some work in progress
Right.
drawings from this. Can
Yeah,
you
this
show
is the
this?
thumbnail. So you can see I was struggling with it. I wasn't quite sure how to pull it off. This is how I write. I write in thumbnail form like this. And I wasn't happy with this. Usually my thumbnails are very accurate to what appears in the book, but in this case, it was something I was struggling with. So I actually had to work it out in the pencil phase. Yeah, right here. I finally figured it out in the pencil stage. I was like, yeah, that's what I want. And I think the next one, yeah, there's the full 3-page sequence. So, you get that rising scream and then it just wails and just carries over the entire scene.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully done.
Thank you.
Yeah, something else that struck me about that original photo was just how people are kind of like wandering around in the background.
Stunned
You know,
disbelief. Yeah,
yeah,
they're really, they couldn't believe what was happening. Yeah.
and I think that's something you capture really well in this spread. That there's like in the background here, you can see kind of students just
Yeah.
kind of like kind of standing around or
Yeah.
not really knowing what to do.
Right. Right. The important point here is that uh, the university was open because the governor refused to close the university because that would be giving into the student radicals. So the guard marched into a campus that it was the noon class break, and Kent State had 21,000 students. Now, if you've ever been in a big university at the noon class break, you know what that's like. I mean, every building empties. The students, go to lunch, they could leave their dorms, they change classes. So suddenly there's this mass of humanity. And the guard marched right into the middle of it and turned and shot their guns right into a parking lot full of, 500-600 students. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, this is a book that I really want to gift to my parents who lived through that time. But then also, I think it's a really wonderful way for people who weren't alive then to learn about what happened.
Well, it's
But
not a nostalgia trip by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I'm not of this generation, so and I'm as tired of, baby boomer nostalgia as you are, believe me, because I grew up right after him. So I was like, oh, Christ, the 60s again. But this is really great history, and it's a really moving, powerful story, and it's incredibly relevant. So for all those reasons, I hope people will pick it up.
well, thanks for talking with me, Derf.
Oh, thank you for having me.